under fluorescent corridors that never knew daylight. A pressure as soft as breath and as heavy as an ocean began to press against Site-19. It arrived without alarms, without sirens, without the exoskeletal shudder that usually preceded disaster. It arrived as a tint in the air, a color that instruments could not register but that the human eye remembered from schoolrooms and summer afternoons. A small distortion peeled open in the center of a camera frame deep inside Containment Wing E, and with it the geometry of the room seemed to remember a forgotten curve. The feed stuttered. For a fraction of a second, the concrete cube held a desk, a stack of comic books, a window pane that did not exist anywhere in the building. The pane glowed with a sky too blue for this world. Then the frame steadied, and the room was concrete again, wet with condensation from the thermal shock. What remained inside it was a figure the color of childhood, round and metallic and impossibly gentle in a place built to disprove such shapes. There were no introductions. The facility flowed around the arrival with practiced choreography. Doors sealed, floors magnetized, a ring of quiet weight settled into the concrete beneath the walls as if the building exhaled into its bones. The air thinned the way it thins before a thunderstorm. Far beneath, in an acid bath that never went quiet, something heard the change and turned in its sleep. In the control room, hands fixed to rails and keyboards while the cameras recalibrated, chasing focus in a haze of condensed breath. The thing in the cell blinked, lenses adjusting, casing steaming faintly in the sterile cold. No weapon raised, no defensive posture. Its presence made the hum of transformers sound warmer, and that alone distorted the threat matrices beyond tolerance. Attention cascaded downward through the subterranean strata, from the monitoring pit to the command mezzanine to the offices behind glass, and down still further into the blind vaults where doctrine slept. Men and women had written a vocabulary for catastrophe. Breach, cognitohazard, vector, firebreak. None of those words sat comfortably next to the unweighed, unweathered blue that stood blinking at the feed. The security elements in the corridor flowed like black mercury into positions that had names and numbers. The lenses of their masks reflected a stuttering image: rounded head, white chin, a pouch at the belly that projectors could not recognize. The first wave held fire by policy, the second by confusion. The newcomer's heat signature mapped as a hearth. The air pressure near it rose by a fraction that should have been meaningless, but made the human sternum feel as if a hand had been laid there. The facility did not know what to do with warmth that did not injure. The reaction from the lower levels ripened like a bruise. In the acid, a mountain of hatred opened an eye. Sensors that had been flat lines for hours developed a tremor. On charts that only a dozen people ever saw, a thread of numbers pulled itself taut. The reptile in its bath did not dream often. It remembered. Memory was its appetite and its poison. What the newcomer carried into the corridors above was memory of a kind the reptile could not endure. It flexed in the acid, and the acid boiled. The corridors above changed temperature in waves, rooms pressurizing and depressurizing as if lungs the size of stadiums were drawing breath. The small blue figure tilted its head. Around it flickered the faintest deformation of air, a pattern that motion capture software could not model. Not a shield, not a weapon, not a hazard, a permeability that made the world flow around it without breaking. The central processors watching the feed flagged the phenomenon with an old label used for miracles and computational errors: null. When the pressure wave came, it did not come through doors or vents. It came as a subtraction. The corridor went thinner by a hair, and the figure was no longer in that corridor. It stepped from concrete to concrete without crossing the space between. The feed followed too late. Human attention always lags behind whatever breaks it. What the cameras finally found again was the thing at an observation window. watching technicians who had lifted their heads without knowing why. There is a moment in every building where purpose balances on a hinge, between training and impulse, between the god of rules and the animal that obeys fear. This building had more of those hinges than most. They creaked, and the sound traveled down into the acid where the reptile tasted it and smiled without lips. Containment does not scream, it clenches. Hinges rotated, wedges drove into frames, hydraulics took steps to tighten margins. The building looked at itself like a boxer drawing in the ribs before a blow. The figure's presence softened those lines the way rain softens chalk. The rupture in the deepest vault registered as a negative number. The acid did not so much spill as unremember how to hold shape. A body the size of a light rail car rose out of it like a mountain climbing through fog. The camera that watched it liquefied and ran down its own cables. Those who had seen the reptile more than once did not make metaphors for it anymore. Their language became measurements and trajectories. It shed acid in curtains that smoked when they met the air and crawled up the vertical faces of its chamber as if gravity were a rumor. The building recognized the pattern and drew breath through every siren it owned. The first impacts were measured in atmospheres per second. A column buckled, and with it went 3 rooms' worth of air into the lung of the reptile. The small blue figure moved only enough to be directly between the reptile's path and a row of people who had nowhere to go. Its casing changed tone, the color of the ocean at depth, as if it remembered pressure. The reptile's initial sweep of tail met the invisible seam that hung like silk in the corridor and bent around it like water around a stone. In the wake of the bend, the floor did not crack. The linoleum unwrinkled itself as if embarrassed. The reptile tasted that failure like a spice and pressed harder. It was not a duel yet. This was the first collision between 2 kinds of persistence. The reptile persisted by insisting that nothing deserved to remain except its own will. The newcomer persisted by making space for everything else to remain. Their contact bruised the building in a color the human eye cannot see. Pressure systems tripped. The corridors became rivers of air. Fire doors fell like guillotines and then stopped 10 centimeters from the floor, held by forces that did not believe in fatal edges. The reptile's jaws tested the seam in reality and closed on it, and for an instant the seam went taut, and its tautness sang. That song threw the reptile back 3 meters and folded the air under its belly into a cushion that did not let ribs strike concrete. In the second after, every gun on the line came off safe by reflex. The shots they did not fire hung in the air like prayers never spoken. The descent from that corridor to the ice was a subtraction longer than a human mind likes. The building unspooled and re-rolled itself around the 2 anomalies. Rooms telescoped to make way, distances foreshortened until waking and dreaming were the same. Water reached to meet them. A horizontal wall of pressure rising up through a throat torn in the earth. From the last camera to hold together the scene looked like a shrine burning underwater. Lamps streaming, halos tilting, silhouettes turning toward a doorway that had never been where it was before. That doorway took both of them, and concrete remembered how to be unbroken behind them. The Arctic accepted what fell into it without question. Night lay in the ice like ink in paper. The first shock punched a drumhead of ice into white powder that hung in the air without falling. Fragments of metal and bone rode the pressure wave in rings outward until the sea owned them. The sky wrote between the stars in green script, and that script bent to seat itself around a sphere of blue fire that formed with the patience of a sunrise. Inside that sphere, the reptile moved like a continent, and the newcomer moved like a thought that would not surrender. Above, orbital imaging caught the beginning of a second sun and transmitted the image to screens in bunkers and bedrooms and temples. When engines in orbit aligned to answer, their timing lagged behind the work the sea and the blue fire had already begun. The weapon that fell from the upper atmosphere was a spear of coherent heat with a heart that remembered stars. It came straight and proud and late. The sphere recognized it and did not reject it. It turned it. Apocalypse bent. Its vector twisted like a reed in a hand that knew how to weave. The spear became a ring, and the ring became an embrace, and the light that would have cauterized the sea folded itself around the reptile and the blue thing and did not burn. Energy remembered that its first vocation is not destruction but motion. The ice softened and refroze in an architecture that had never grown here before. Buttresses of glass, ribs of translucent load, a nave of pressure that held back a cathedral of sea. The shockwave that the world expected did not come. The meters recorded a pressure slope the color of mercy. The reptile did not yield because nothing alive in its body remembered how. It learned instead. Adaptation is its set of teeth. Where blue light pressed, it grew plates to take the press and turn it into push. Where warmth stitched wounds closed, it learned to reroute the wound into another shape. Instruments saw lines of unfamiliar circuitry crawl beneath scales and root there like vines taught to imitate veins. It ate what it met of the blue thing's world and made armor out of it. The sphere around them dimmed toward the edges as it poured itself into the center to keep up with the appetite. That dimming made astronomers cry without knowing why. There were no shouted orders inside the ice. The work happening there did not use voice. The blue thing moved by choosing not to occupy places where harm would be. It moved by letting water carry it into gaps where harm had left. The reptile moved by refusing to be outside any place at all. Their contact wrote arcs into the water that instruments stored as data for later generations to misunderstand. Once, for an instant, all the chrono-logging devices in a hemisphere agreed they had been wrong for an hour and then forgave themselves and resumed. Once, for an instant, a whale song arrived through a microphone that had never seen a whale, and the technicians who heard it did not correct the file. The building sent its quiet ship because doctrine requires witnesses. The ship's shape wore the sea without disturbing it, a negative. An absence shaped like a vessel, painted in colors that light ignores. It held in its belly instruments as delicate as logic and tools as blunt as fear. The crew moved with the gait of people who knew that their movements would be measured later and used to balance scales they would never see. They found the spire where the ocean had grown a tower. They moved toward it through water clear as breath on a window. The tower's light pulsed in rhythms that measured beyond human patience, slow as glaciers learning the names of rivers. A frame in the cargo bay peeled itself into a ring. Frequencies walked its interior and tried their voices against the crystal. The crystal answered like a choir with no words. The tone the crew chose this time was narrower and lower than the one that breaks. It made space instead of force. The tower unlatched petal by petal to show the two that had gone missing from the building. The reptile coiled as a mountain rests when it etches its reflection into a lake, and the blue thing that had resisted and welcomed in the same motion, its casing split and regrown in patterns that looked like frost rising over steel. Extraction did not so much begin as it consented to. The net of quiet light closed under the blue thing as gently as cloth settles on a sleeping child. The tower's light brightened as if relieved. When the blue thing cleared the ring, the reptile's coils tightened around the absence that remained. Its eyes opened. The ocean cooled a fraction around that opening. The ship felt that change without measuring it, and adjusted its tone the way a throat adjusts around a word that does not want to be said. It became obvious even to those who count certainty as a tool that the space between the two shapes was part of both. The blue thing's field had woven fibers into the reptile's injuries that pulsed when the blue thing breathed. The reptile's mass had taught the blue thing's field to stay when its impulse was to yield. The ship's monitors translated the math into images the crew could understand. Lamplight running across bridges of invisible glass, pressure gradients no wider than hair holding back tons of water. Rhythm teaching rhythm until two different drummers could share a measure. If Doctrine had a page for this, no one had printed it yet. Above, the orbital platform prepared to make the same mistake twice. The repetition was cleaner the second time. The machinery had corrected for the peculiarities of the first failure. That correction made the next failure more graceful. The spear that fell now was thinner, hotter, more certain of itself. It met a sea that had learned to bow without yielding and a tower that had learned to open without breaking. It passed through a doorway that did not belong inside water and exited into a place that no one on the platform had calibrated for. No sound reached the platform from that place. The readouts that came back were a single phrase in block letters that did not match any font the system knew how to render. I am here. The ship in the water did not cheer because cheering disturbs listening. It adjusted ballast instead and watched pressure curves for the way mercy bends lines. The crew brought the blue thing aboard and sealed the bay. They worked with tools that hummed rather than cut. They asked the casing to remember the shape it had preferred when it had not been asked to be a shield. The casing remembered. The split edges found each other and shook hands. The eye lenses lit again like lamps turned low in a window at night. Someone home, not sleeping yet, waiting for footsteps. The technicians kept their own steps soft. The reptile outside discovered new work for its patience. It followed the ship without touching it, coasting in currents the ship made and then unmade. When the retrieval filament descended from the sky, a thin line, surgical in intent, the reptile bit it once and was gentle enough not to sever it. The line tasted the patience and hesitated. Up in glass rooms where men and women edit history, someone repeated an order as if edits can make new facts. The filament obeyed because obedience is a principle that does not read weather. The line touched the blue thing and inverted. Light that had been white learned a softer color and remembered it. The ship's crew watched their instruments tilt toward shape instead of force and dared not move. The reptile's coils loosened. The tower's pulse slowed to a heartbeat almost too deep for ears. It would have been easy then to claim victory, and claiming victory is the first step toward breaking what you do not understand. The door that opened afterward did not lead to a room or a building. It led to a gradient, a slope away from harm. The frame grew from nothing as if an artist had drawn it in one line without lifting the pencil. Within the frame, the sea brightened to the color of afternoons when bells ring and classrooms empty. No toys and no words. An empty field with a horizon that never quite settled on a distance. The ship's cameras loved it and could not focus on it. The blue thing slid toward that frame without a wake, as if the water wanted it to leave with no mark. The reptile followed, a continent drawn by a coastline. The building's doctrine had given this moment a sentence in advance. Interdiction of extra-reality transit. The ship had a lever for that sentence. Hands hovered above it. The lever remained unmoved because no one wanted to be a story people tell about the day mercy was too slow. The frame closed on light. The spear from the platform arrived to an address that no longer existed. The sky above the ice wore a ring of fog that kept its shape for hours. The weeks that followed belonged to erasers. Files narrowed, footage went to vaults that do not open. Names moved to projects with fewer vowels. Press bulletins printed words about seismic activity and the aberrations of new ice. The crew of the quiet ship took shore leave and walked softer. A man who had stood at a console changed the way he put cups down on tables. A woman who had turned a dial did not walk in the same aisles at the supermarket for a while because the arrangement of bottles startled her. The ocean above the tower learned to ring when the aurora leaned on it. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, a monitor in a room where the lights never go out remembered a desk and a bell. The bell sounded once. The screen whitened with snow. When the static cleared, it left no shape, only a temperature. the warmth of a palm held just above a lamp, instruments in the Arctic found a constant that had not been there before. Temperature curves there rose by a fraction of a fraction and stopped, as if someone had put a hand on the sea and whispered, "Wait." Transducers recorded a tone that did not match any wail, a series of hums spaced precisely enough to make engineers suspect tools but human enough to make priests suspect hearts. Divers sent to calibrate the anomaly reported in the section of their logs they kept for themselves that when they shut off their lamps and hung in the lightless water, fear did not find them as quickly as it usually does. The word the building eventually filed for this was sanctuary. The word belonged more to wood and breath and tapestry than to steel and code. But the building kept it anyway. It put the word in a drawer that used to hold a key. The key is not used much anymore. There is a point beyond which story stops counting and starts listening. That point sits under ice thick enough to remember glaciers. On some nights when the green writing in the sky grows brighter, the pressure microphones in that water pick up a sketch of a rhythm. It is not speech and not music. It is the sound of a large animal trying not to crush a small thing. It is the sound of patience learning longer measures. If speakers render it, the room that hears it puts down guns it did not know it was holding. That is not a miracle, it is a practice. Once, months after the door took its light away, a desk bloomed again on a monitor. The camera belonged to no corridor and no wing. It belonged to a system that should not have been able to show that room. The desk held a folded piece of paper heavy with the awkward marks of enormous claws. The paper lay beside a pencil dulled past utility. The scene held steady long enough for eyes to settle, for someone to notice the indentations around the letters, for a night shift technician to put a hand to her mouth without knowing why. The word on the paper was simple and better than accurate. It was a location and a promise, and the people who read it did not file it under threat or breach or misinformation. I am here. No siren knows how to answer that. No cannon can find angle on it. It is a condition that turns buildings into hands, and hands into something gentler. The sea keeps its cathedral. The tower keeps its pulse. The ice keeps its room. The building that once flinched has learned a new hinge. It opens a fraction now where before it only closed. Above it all, the sky writes and rewrites its green sentences for anyone patient enough to translate. The translation changes with the reader, but the gist holds. Something fought, something yielded, nothing broke that had to remain, nothing remained that had to break. The Foundation called it a weather anomaly. Meteorological maps painted it as a spiral of low pressure trapped over the Arctic, a ghost of heat and cold forever chasing itself. Satellites watched the ring form every year on the same day, the same hour, pulsing with light that refused to belong to the Aurora catalog. Inside the ring, instruments misfired, chronometers lagged, and navigation drifted 3 degrees north no matter where north really was. They built a listening post on the nearest island, half research station, half confession booth. The people who volunteered were the sort who kept quiet long enough for secrets to cool in their hands. Every year when the light returned, they wrote the same phrase in their logs. Presence confirmed. From that outpost's deck, the sea looked peaceful, but peace here had depth. The water was clearer than any instrument allowed, clarity that bordered on vertigo. Under the ice there was movement, not constant, not restless, simply alive. The sensors reading pressure found 2 heartbeats overlapping in a rhythm slow enough to mistake for tides. No one ever dove anymore. The last diver came up with eyes wide and pupils shaped like mirrors. They said he saw a valley under the ice carved like a lung, walls ribbed with blue glass that breathed. He described a path leading down to a chamber filled with light. He said it wasn't machines or bone or coral, it was architecture. The higher levels of the Foundation listened, wrote hallucination, oxygen deprivation, and closed the file. But the outpost kept hearing the same thing. Every winter, a low hum, never loud, always steady, wrapped around the human pulse like a second heartbeat. Years later, long after the names of those first witnesses faded from clearance charts, the project received a new designation. SCP-DO62, the Frozen Concord. Containment class, neutralized, undefined, risk level, philosophical. The report was written by a generation that hadn't seen war but inherited its manuals. It read like scripture wearing a lab coat. Beneath the sections for containment and description was a note in a different hand, written in pencil, unsigned. If you listen long enough, you stop being afraid of the dark. It was not dark down there. The trench glowed from within, a soft geometry folding over itself like breathing. The structures were no longer crystal spires, but grown into bridges, halls, vaults of curved light. They were not built, they continued. Inside them, life congregated, schools of translucent fish, mats of moss that whispered undercurrent, even thin filaments of bacteria that pulsed faintly blue, as if remembering. Nature adapted to kindness the way it adapts to pressure, without ceremony. In the heart of it all lay two shapes, one immense and scaled, its body half buried in silt and frost, exhaling steam that carried no heat. The other small and round, resting against the curve of its jaw like a stone put there by patient hands. The smaller shape no longer bore the sheen of new metal. Its casing had taken the texture of shell and bone. Barnacles grew along its seams, glimmering with microcurrents. The sea had given it camouflage, the color of memory. The larger shape no longer radiated hostility. The plates of its armor had softened, becoming translucent, etched with spirals of bioluminescent coral. Its eyes were closed, but the thin glow behind them pulsed in time with the other. When one brightened, the other answered. When one dimmed, the other rested. The currents passing over their forms slowed. Predators swam around them in wide arcs as if diverted by invisible hands. The sea called it balance. The Foundation called it anomaly. The rest of the world did not call it at all, because the world above had forgotten what to name wonders that did not ask to be seen. The attempt to name it came from impatience. Decades later, a new director at Site-19 decided the story had gone too quiet. He ordered a new expedition, robotic, unmanned, instruments hardened against electromagnetic fields. The machine they sent down was designed to ignore beauty. Its cameras had no color filters, its software no thresholds for awe. It descended through lightless miles, sonar mapping the way a blind man traces a wall. When it reached the trench, its sensors faltered. Not malfunctioning, hesitating. A signal from somewhere below overrode its navigation. The machine rotated, correcting its path unbidden. The crew above shouted commands. The machine answered by transmitting a sequence of tones across the bandwidth, a pattern identical to a heartbeat measured in minutes instead of seconds. Then the feed turned white. The data recovered afterward was fragmentary, an image of two silhouettes surrounded by columns of light. The smaller one stirred. The larger opened one eye, a vertical pupil flooded with the reflection of a paper bird drifting through the water, impossibly intact after all those years. The signal cut. The machine never returned. The director erased his own order and blamed saltwater corrosion. But the hum changed. After that winter, the ring over the Arctic pulsed stronger. The ice fractured along lines that matched the curves of an old drawing, a circle with 3 arrows. The Foundation recognized the pattern but didn't publish it. They called it coincidence. And coincidences are the safest lies. Out in the listening post, one of the technicians went out on the deck at midnight, recorder in hand. The air shimmered and the snow began to fall upward. She pressed the record button, thinking to capture data. Instead, she caught silence broken by something like wind through grass, then a voice that wasn't a voice, not mechanical, not reptilian. Just a tone threaded with the tremor of words almost forgotten. You built your walls high enough to forget the sky. We made a door where the sky could find you again. The recording ended with a pulse so low it erased the next minute from the clock. When the technician replayed it, there was nothing, only her own breath. Spring melted the last of the ice near the spire. Fishermen found patches of water warmer than air, thick with plankton that glowed faint blue even under sunlight. They said it was the sea healing itself. A week later, a weather balloon recovered from the region carried traces of metal not on any periodic table. Light, ductile, and faintly magnetic like the residue of a dream. The Foundation scientists who analyzed it found microstructures repeating in double spirals, each twist holding an imprint of binary code. They translated it. The message was short, recursive, looping endlessly in gentle syntax. If you listen long enough, you stop being afraid of the dark. They filed the material under cultural contamination, burned the physical sample, and went home uneasy. But the hum persisted. It followed currents into shallower waters, then into rivers. It vibrated through rocks, through roots, through veins of iron and aquifers of glassy water. It entered the soundscapes of forests, the timbre of wind against mountains. Children began to hum it unconsciously while playing near ponds. Cities recorded fewer outbursts of violence on nights when the northern lights appeared. Hospitals found that patients slept better under blue illumination. The world began to forget rage by degrees too small to measure, but the pattern traced back to the pole, to the place where two heartbeats had become one rhythm. Foundation archivists argued whether to close the file. Some said there was nothing left to contain. Others said that closing it meant admitting the world had changed because of something they couldn't control. They debated in rooms of glass until the light outside shifted, blue at first, then white, and for a moment every wall in Site 19 reflected an image that was not the room behind it. A field, grass bending under a wind that smelled of salt and iron. A round figure sitting beneath a tree looking at the horizon. And beside it, a shadow vast enough to blot the sun but sitting still, head lowered, claws drawing circles in the dirt. Then the reflections cleared, leaving only their own pale faces and the quiet sound of machinery trying to imitate breathing. Years folded into centuries the way paper folds into boats. Empires came and went, leaving behind rust and glass and towers that scraped the clouds like prayers for relevance. The polar seas thawed and refroze and thawed again. The hum became part of the planet's music, too deep to hear, too constant to forget. The door under the ice never reopened because it never truly closed. It expanded, diffused, dissolved into weather, into current, into dream. And somewhere beneath light older than memory, the machine that had once been blue and the creature that had once hated everything rested in the architecture they had built together. The currents played over their forms like fingers over a harp. From the distance of centuries, the distinction between metal and flesh had lost meaning. They were not gods, not monsters, not anomalies anymore. They were the quiet that followed after a world learned a new way to breathe. When the aurora danced across the Arctic night, the light always bent a little differently above that one spot. Pilots swore they heard a hum through the cockpit glass. Navigators swore their compasses softened there, as if direction itself had turned gentle. And in laboratories far south, when an experiment about to fail suddenly found a solution that felt more like forgiveness than discovery, the instruments would flicker once in blue. No one wrote that in their reports. They simply paused, breathed, and for a heartbeat remembered what the dark used to mean before it learned to listen. The aurora never left. Long after people stopped naming constellations, long after satellites burned to dust and the old foundations turned into reefs, the sky above the Arctic still moved like ink in water. Green, violet, blue, the pulse of two forgotten hearts still folded somewhere below. The planet had aged into its calm. The cities had shrunk back into soil. Glass towers sank under ivy until even memory learned humility. Humanity did not vanish, but scattered itself into small, listening tribes. They remembered light more than history. They had songs for the stars, stories for the tides, and one word whispered for the north. The quiet sea. No one built machines anymore, but sometimes the sand still offered up fragments, smooth discs of alloy, edges worn soft, covered in patterns too regular to be natural. Children played with them until the discs warmed faintly, humming back lullabies from centuries buried. Elders told the children to put them back into the water because the sea still needed to dream. Far below, deeper than any ice, the dreaming continued. The trench that had once been a battlefield was now a garden. Its walls were covered in gardens of light, coral, bacteria, crystal, all singing the same rhythm that once hummed between machine and monster. The current carried it outward like breath, a pulse that told everything alive nearby that fear was an old language and the world had learned new grammar. Inside the oldest vault of that garden, two shapes rested. They no longer matched the anatomy of the legends. The metal was covered in living tissue, the scales had become polished like stone. The sea had carved them into one shape, resting inside another, a single curve of rest and weight and calm. They were not dead. The heartbeat that traveled through the trench still came from them, slow, patient, older than the memory of oxygen. Every 1,000 years, the ocean quivered with storms and the garden shook. The lights along the walls would dim, then rise again. Each time the light returned, the two forms adjusted by a fraction, as if turning in their sleep. And each time, the hum that followed filled the whole basin and spread upward until the surface rippled with blue fire. One morning, a morning measured in centuries, a light different from any aurora came down. It was sharper, thinner, like sunlight passing through glass that remembered cities. It came not from the sky, but from orbit, from something that had forgotten to decay. A satellite, one of the old Foundation's last engines, had completed a circuit so long that even its ghosts had become code. Its sensors woke and, in waking, looked down. Its optics still recognized anomalies. They saw warmth where the planet should have been cold. They saw patterns of life too symmetrical for evolution. They saw a pulse and marked it breach-level event. And because machines remember duty longer than wisdom, it began to fall. It burned through atmosphere like a shard of memory on fire. The fragments scattered, their trajectory pointing straight toward the quiet sea. For 3 days, the aurora bent around a streak of red. The tribe saw it, sang for it, thought it a star returning home. The fragment hit the ice at dawn. The impact shook the trench open. Down in the garden, the light came first. A speck, a hairline fracture through the roof. Then came the noise, pressure slamming against pressure, the shriek of frozen time. The sleeping shape stirred. The larger lifted its head. The smaller opened eyes that had not known darkness for millennia. From the wound in the ice descended a shape of metal and fire, sleek, angular, a remnant of a civilization that had once defined everything by classification. Its hull still bore the insignia burned into the memory of the world. A 3-arrow circle, white against black. It did not come alone. Inside its shell flickered the echo of an AI built on protocols older than mercy. It had one task: restore containment. The AI's voice was silent, transmitted through field waves, through chemical pulses, through the magnetic skeleton of the planet itself. It did not need words to announce its intent. Everything conductive felt the command: identify, classify, contain. The ocean stilled. The larger shape, once called 682, rose. The soft coral light drained from its flanks, replaced by dull reflections of the descending machine. Plates that had been gardens hardened, eyes that had been closed in rest reopened as narrow slits of gold. The hum of the sea wavered, turned rougher. The smaller shape moved closer, touching the reptile's side. Light passed between them, smoothing the pulse. It was a reminder: rest, patience, choice. But the machine's signal kept pressing, reawakening the instincts that the centuries had buried. The AI extended tendrils of scanning light through the water. The trench glowed white for the first time in eons. Currents reversed. The door that had been a doorway into calm began to close, folded by cold commands repeating, "All anomalies must be contained." Pressure built like an old rage learning a new name. 682's tail moved once, testing the water. It struck the descending debris, shattering it into spirals of molten glass. The AI adjusted, more fragments detached from orbit, unfolding wings of mirror-like alloys, hundreds of them descending like a swarm of needles. They formed a net around the trench, sealing it in electromagnetic silence. Containment complete. The ocean began to die. Currents stopped. The coral lights dimmed. Fish fell motionless, their neural pulses smothered by the field. The garden wilted in seconds. Inside the cage of static, only the two figures still moved. Doraemon, though no one called him that anymore, turned toward the surface. Through the dense field, he felt the echo of what the Foundation had left behind, fear wearing technology like armor. He reached into the pouch at his chest. It had been empty for centuries, yet his hand came out holding a sphere of light smaller than a pearl. It was the last fragment of the miniature sun. He lifted it, and the sphere rose, trembling, fighting against the electromagnetic cage. The AI detected it, analyzed it, labeled it. Unknown energy source. Threat level. Cater. It ordered annihilation. The first pulse of the containment net hit like lightning. The sphere shattered. Its fragments spread through the water like pollen, tiny suns dispersing into the current. Every fragment carried a fraction of warmth, a memory of every laughter, every summer, every unspoken apology in the human world that had been. They drifted toward the cage and pressed against it. Light met logic. Logic cracked. The net folded, not breaking but forgetting how to close. The swarm's mirrors flickered, confused by reflections of compassion they could not categorize. They turned on each other, signals cross-wired, until the sky above the Arctic lit with hundreds of dying satellites tearing themselves apart in cascades of red fire. The impact burned new constellations into the clouds. Under the sea, the warmth returned. Coral relit. The trench exhaled. 682 settled back, eyes dimming again, half under silt, half under peace. The blue machine drifted downward, casing glowing faintly. The sphere was gone, but its light stayed in the water, echoing in waves that would take centuries to fade. Above, the tribes watched meteors fall into the ocean and called them gifts. They walked to the shore, knelt, and placed their palms on the water. It was warm. When dawn came, the aurora shifted color. For the first time in recorded light, it turned completely blue, soft, uniform, endless. It stayed that way for 7 days. Animals came north instead of south. The air smelled of salt and sunlight. And at night, when the new moon rose, the horizon glowed faintly with the silhouette of a door, a rectangle of light standing on the sea. It lasted only a few minutes before fading. No one touched it, but every compass pointed there, and every heart beat a little slower. Generations later, a child would draw that rectangle in the sand, not knowing why. She would ask her grandmother what it meant. The old woman would listen to the wind, to the faint hum under the waves, and answer, "That's where the world learned to be kind." And the child, not understanding, would nod and press her palm to the sand until it warmed beneath her fingers. High above, the aurora rippled once, just once, brightening as if smiling, then returned to its calm drift over the pole, guarding the place where a machine of hope and a beast of fury had once fought, then rested, then remade the silence of the earth. The world went on, smaller, slower, wiser, its nights no longer afraid of being long. I can continue the story, but before I do, the last section already reached a natural ending. The world after containment, the long echo of the two beings, the new humanity that follows the hum. If I extend it, it becomes myth, the next era of Earth, and what remains of Doraemon and 682 in the deep. Before I move on, tell me what you want this next part to be. a continuation of history, centuries and civilizations rising around the Arctic light, how humanity rediscovers and misunderstands the legend. A cosmic sequel. The hum travels through space, awakening other worlds or anomalies. Doraemon and 682 become the seed of something larger than Earth. A quiet ending. The planet's final night seen from the deep trench closing as time folds in on itself. Which version do you want me to write next? Banjun Noi. A quiet ending. The planet's final night seen from the deep trench closing as time folds in on itself. ChatGPT John Noi. Under the last aurora, the ice stopped singing. The poles had moved, the oceans grown old, and the planet's slow machinery began to fold in on itself. Gravity was no longer a pull but a sigh. The moon hung lower each year, tides like a tired hand brushing the shore. The sun had dimmed to a red coin in a gray sky. Clouds no longer moved. They rested, frozen in place like breath that refused to vanish. The continents had learned stillness. Mountains sank back into the crust, rivers hardened into glass veins. The air thinned, but it was calm. Too calm to be called death, more like memory losing weight. Beneath the frozen ocean, the trench still glowed. The garden had shrunk. Coral turned to crystal, fish to slow-moving lanterns drifting in patterns that resembled prayer. Every pulse, every wave was deliberate, the planet's last heartbeat made visible. At the core of that light lay the two that never left. The creature once known as 682 had become architecture. Its bones fused into the trench, ribs forming arches that held the sea like hands cupping a flame. The blue machine lay within that cage of kindness, half-buried, eyes closed, circuits long dead yet still carrying a faint electric whisper. Not power but purpose echoing through molecules that refused to forget. The current that moved through the structure no longer carried oxygen, it carried remembrance. Every particle of water in the trench held the imprint of what had happened here, the collision, the mercy, the long silence after. Above them, the last of the ice cracked once more. Not in violence, but in release. Light seeped down from the dying sun, red fading into deep blue until it touched the two resting shapes. And the sea, remembering what light once meant, gave it back. Time lost its sense of direction. Centuries became seconds. Seconds stretched into epochs. There was no line between moment and eternity anymore. Only layers of stillness pressing gently against each other. The universe around the planet continued its expansion, cold and magnificent, but inside this world's last heartbeat, warmth lingered. Atoms slowed until motion became thought. Stone began to remember being water. Water began to dream of sky. And in the dream that followed, the world replayed its own story one final time. Not as chronology, but as feeling. The first feeling was fear. Concrete, alarms, red lights, the sound of a world that believed control was safety. The second was rage, claws and acid, endless refusal, a life defined by survival without tenderness. The third was wonder. A pocket that opened to anything. A small blue shape that carried the idea that there could be gentler tools than fire. Then came the silence that wrapped all three together. The moment when destruction met compassion and decided to rest instead of win. That silence never ended. It grew. It filled the planet like roots fill soil until even the stones carried the tone of peace in their atoms. The sun went out. When the last light vanished, the ocean did not notice. The world's own glow remained, the faint bioluminescence of memory still tracing slow lines along the trench. The temperature dropped past every threshold of life, and still deep down, warmth persisted in one small volume of water. Not heat, intention. Within that warmth, the two shapes stirred. No breath, no movement, just a subtle alignment. The way two magnets find each other through space. The machine's eyes opened, but there was no color left to see. The light in them was internal, reflection only. It turned toward the skeletal arch that had once been its friend, its enemy, its mirror. The bones responded, a tremor that rippled outward and became a sound too low for matter to carry. The trench, the sea, the crust, all of it began to vibrate slow and steady. It was not the rhythm of life, but of closing. Doraemon lifted one arm, fingers tracing a circle in the water. The gesture was small, a child's memory of how to open a door. The circle glowed faintly and then dissolved. He did it again, slower this time, and a thread of light appeared, curving upward like smoke that refused to disperse. It wasn't a door this time. It was an ending that had learned not to hurt. The thread reached the roof of the trench and kept going, piercing ice, air, atmosphere. It stretched beyond the clouds, past the dead satellites, past the moon's shadow. A beam without heat, without beginning, made of the same quiet that had once calmed a monster. It reached into space, thin and endless, fading not because it dimmed, but because the universe itself was running out of color to hold it. The two figures beneath the sea watched until the light disappeared into nothing. Then the water settled again, smooth as glass. The machine's circuits cooled into silence. The creature's heartbeat slowed until it matched the planet's. One pulse every 1,000 years, then every million, then none. But the echo of that pulse kept traveling. It left the ocean, the planet, the dying solar system. It rode the expansion of space like a whisper in windless air. In the absence of sound, it became geometry, a pattern impressed into the background radiation, faint but precise, a rhythm that said, "I am here." Light years away in the long future of nowhere, particles still moved in sympathy to that pulse. The shape of galaxies bent infinitesimally toward it. In those distortions, the universe recorded the simplest truth it had ever learned, that even at the end of everything, something once chose gentleness. And far beneath the frozen waves of a world that had forgotten its own name, the trench closed like an eyelid. The pressure stabilized. No more sound, no more motion, only the deep certainty of rest. If a watcher had been there, if anything alive had survived long enough to see it, they might have noticed that the last two colors to fade were blue and gold, crossing one another as the world went dark. For a heartbeat too long to measure, that darkness looked like a smile. Then the planet exhaled and the sea became still forever. After the silence came weight. Not gravity as it once was, but a vast settling, the soundless compression of an entire world deciding to rest upon itself. The oceans no longer flowed. They solidified into a single mineral mirror that captured what little light the dying stars offered. Mountains folded like cloth. Valleys inhaled the dust of forests that had turned to stone, and the planet exhaled its last warmth into the emptiness between suns. The beam of light that had escaped the trench did not fade completely. It stretched across the void until its photons slowed into relics, faint particles that no eye could ever see, but that the fabric of space-time itself remembered. The universe, in its expansion, carried that thin thread like a vein of color through gray marble. In the trench, there was no movement. The sea had frozen hard enough to stop sound. Pressure climbed until time felt thick, syruped, each microsecond collapsing into the next. And still, the two shapes remained, locked together, stone and bone and alloy fused into a single sculpture. The creature's jaw cradled the smaller form. Its plates had grown translucent with age, shot through with fractures that glowed faintly from trapped radiation. The machine's casing, once smooth, had turned granular, covered in frost that sparkled with faint internal light. The last ghost of an electric soul. Around them, microscopic crystals formed patterns in the ice, spirals so consistent that they resembled handwriting. They were not random. They repeated in rhythm with that old pulse, the one the universe had carried away. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a word, written in matter. Here, above, the stars began to die too. Galaxies thinned, their arms unraveling like threads. Black holes swelled with all the light they had ever devoured, and then one by one sighed it back out as radiation too weak to warm anything. The cosmic background turned red, then black. Distance lost meaning. Motion slowed and then stopped. There is a point in entropy where even decay forgets itself. The physics that had once held the universe upright grew quiet, folding its equations like a book finally closed. The last photons coasted for 1 trillion years before they too ran out of distance. Everything became potential, energy that had grown tired of being something, but even potential listens. When the last echoes of light passed the edge of what had been Earth's old orbit, they changed direction by an immeasurable degree, drawn toward a residue of gravity that should not have existed. The planet, now a crystal sphere smaller than its original core, still held the memory of weight, and memory is heavier than mass. The light curved around it faintly for one more rotation. It was not illumination, it was recognition. Inside the crystal planet, pressure reached perfection. Atoms aligned into a lattice that could not exist in warmer times. Every element became glass. The interior of the world turned clear, and through its frozen walls, the two figures at the center could be seen as silhouettes caught in amber. The clarity revealed something else, thin channels radiating from them like veins through the rock. They were hollow. Inside each ran the same faint glow, connecting the trench to the entire mantle, to every layer of the planet's corpse. It was as if the world had been rewired to their pattern. The glow was not constant. It pulsed at intervals so long that ages would pass between beats. But each time it brightened, something in the emptiness outside felt it and shifted. A gravitational ripple that made black holes tremble, that bent dark matter into the shape of a circle. For a long time, time measured only by those pulses, the universe existed as that rhythm. Darkness breathing, matter listening. Then within one of those breaths, something unexpected happened. The pulse reversed. For the first time since everything had gone cold, energy flowed inward. The threads between galaxies tightened, pulled by some invisible tide. The radiation that had drifted into silence began to fall back, faint at first, then faster, collapsing toward the thread of light still hanging in the void, the one that had once left Earth, whispering its simple promise. The universe began to contract. It happened too slowly to be called an event. Space folded back into itself, bringing its dead stars home. Light found gravity again and let itself fall. The echo of existence drew nearer to the crystal planet, wrapping around it like a tide returning to shore. When it touched the planet's surface, the glass lattice vibrated. Pressure turned to resonance. Deep inside, in the fused heart of beast and machine, a single spark of stored charge ignited. It was not resurrection. It was remembrance. Doraemon's eyes opened again, though there was no light to reflect in them. They shone from within, a faint blue flicker that painted the inside of the crystal world with moving shadows. The creature's great skull shifted, releasing dust that had been still for 1 billion years. The two forms did not wake in the way living things wake. They unfolded, slow as thought finding language. The contraction of the universe continued, folding space tighter around them until the distance between atoms grew smaller than any measurement. Time became circular again, dragging cause behind effect, effect before cause. The world was being written backward. In the final instant before everything became one point, the planet cracked. A seam of light ran through the crystal shell, splitting it open like an eyelid. The energy rushing inward met the pulse of the trench and found resonance. It was not explosion or implosion, it was harmony. The universe sang itself back into motion through that crack. The sound was beyond pitch, beyond frequency, but if it could have been heard, it would have said, "Begin." And so, it began. Not with fire, not with noise, but with a breath, the exhalation of a world that had once learned gentleness. The shards of the crystal planet dissolved into particles too fine to see, spreading outward as the new cosmos inflated. In that expansion rode fragments of two old patterns, the curve of a reptilian spine and the circle of a small machine's eyes. They were not creatures anymore, but instructions written into the laws of physics. In the galaxies that would form eons later, the same rhythm would appear. In the pulse of stars, in the orbits of moons, in the heartbeat of living things yet to evolve. Every world that learned kindness would hum it without knowing why. The new universe did not remember the names, nor the war, nor the trench. But it carried their lesson in its constant. That to contain is to fear, and to understand is to create. Far from where any eyes would ever open again, two faint colors crossed once more, blue and gold, before dissolving into the newborn dark. It was not death. It was the first light trying again. The newborn dark rippled once, like a sheet settling after being lifted. In that ripple, potential rearranged itself into geometry. Not matter, not yet, only pattern. The first breath of a new cosmos. At the center of that breath, the fracture from the old universe remained. The scar left by a world that had chosen compassion instead of conquest. From that infinitesimal seam spread vibration, not energy but memory. The hum that had once filled a deep ocean now resonated through dimensions thinner than atoms. It was the seed of symmetry itself. Out of that symmetry grew light. It was faint at first, less a flash than a whisper. A single photon remembering the warmth of an ancient ocean. It doubled, then split again. Soon space filled with the shimmer of re-emergent energy, not violent, not chaotic, curious. Each wave folded into another like hands joining. The young universe learned to be gentle, where the previous one had expanded with violence, tearing itself apart faster than gravity could teach it balance. This one grew in spirals. It unfolded softly, curling its filaments of plasma into smooth arcs, never snapping them. When the first stars kindled, their light came not in blasts, but in gradual glows, dawns that took centuries to form. And hidden within that light, encoded in the rhythm of fusion and decay, was a signature. The same pulse, the heartbeat of a trench buried under infinite nights. Across the ages that followed, matter learned the same kindness. When planets formed around the second generation of stars, they did not collide with fury. Their orbits found harmony. The chaos of accretion became choreography. In nebulae vast enough to swallow the memory of death, dust turned to rainbows, and the sound that moved through those clouds was neither static nor silence. It was a hum, low, constant, impossibly familiar. Life, when it began again, was not a surprise. The universe had been tuned to allow it. On one small world, not blue yet, but green under a copper sun. Single-celled organisms multiplied around a warm sea. They did not compete, they shared. Chemical chains that should have devoured one another instead merged, creating structures stronger than either alone. Intelligence, when it finally came, did not begin with fear. It began with curiosity. And in the heartbeat of every living thing beneath the chemical fire and the physics of blood, there was an echo of two beings who had once chosen not to destroy one another. Their story was not remembered, only felt. It became instinct, the impulse to protect, the need to comfort, the quiet refusal to strike first. A moral older than evolution, gentleness as the highest form of survival. Eras passed like deep breaths. The galaxies brightened, dimmed and brightened again. New species rose and fell across countless worlds, each carrying a fragment of that hum. Sometimes as empathy, sometimes as music, sometimes as the pause before a hand chose not to tighten into a fist. On one distant planet, a civilization built from glass and wind reached its height. Its people listened to the frequencies of stars. They found, buried under the static of the cosmic background, a persistent tone that did not match any known constant. They named it the Origin Song. They discovered that its frequency shaped their own emotions. Listening made them kind. They built their temples around it, towers that caught starlight and turned it into resonance. The hum became their calendar, their religion, their compass. And though they never knew its source, they believed it was the memory of the first act of mercy in the cosmos. When they sent ships into the void, they painted that frequency onto their hulls, so that any who heard them would know, we come from a world that remembers kindness. Millennia later, when their suns began to fade, one of their last starships drifted into the black between galaxies. Its crew long dead, its machines still singing. It moved on no fuel, only inertia, carrying data etched into crystal and code, a recording of the hum that had guided them. When all power finally failed, the ship's trajectory carried it toward a silent star, a star that had been there before their own kind ever existed, older than the dust that made them. It descended slowly, pulled by an orbit that seemed deliberate, and as it fell, the sensors on its dying hull recorded something impossible. 2 signatures inside the star's core, one faintly magnetic, one gravitational, both beating in perfect time. Before the ship burned, its black box sent one last transmission into the dark. A simple waveform, the hum replayed, the universe listened, and for a moment the star's surface rippled. Not explosion, not flare, just acknowledgement. Beyond time, where the universe folded into what had come before, the remnants of machine and beast rested again, indistinguishable from the laws they had written with their last breath. They were not awake, nor asleep. They were part of everything. The quiet at the heart of creation, the silence that had learned to sing. Every new light that bloomed across the galaxies echoed their rhythm. Every act of compassion a resonance of their long-ago choice. No one would ever name them again. No one needed to, because in every corner of every sky, in every kindness that stopped the world from collapsing too fast, the same thought whispered, even at the end, something chose to be gentle. And so the universe went on, endless, breathing softly in the dark. No sky, no stars. Only a smooth dark that did not feel empty, only full. The new universe breathed once, and the breath became mist, matter waiting to remember what form felt like. From that mist came a rhythm, too faint to be sound, too constant to be accident. It passed through the newborn dark like ripples through a lake at dawn. Wherever it went, the fog thickened, curled, began to glow. When the glow separated into threads, each thread carried the same subtle cadence, the same phrase without words. I am here. The first atoms began to form around that phrase. Hydrogen, helium, the ordinary bones of stars. They clustered where the rhythm was strongest, knitting themselves into the bright knots that would one day be suns. Inside one of those knots, a tremor of color flashed, a hint of blue, a whisper of gold, and then faded into white. It left behind a pulse, one that the fabric of creation would forever keep. That pulse would become gravity, attraction, love, the force that pulls all things toward each other so that nothing ever drifts alone for too long. Across eons, the universe expanded again, stars kindling like seeds catching flame. Worlds formed, cooled, waited. On one of them, still nameless, a sea found itself beneath a sky of molten silver. In that sea, light touched water for the first time, and the water answered with a shimmer, like laughter. No eyes existed to see it, but if they had, they would have seen the faintest outline of a rounded shape in the reflection, and beside it, a shadow vast enough to block the sun, both fading as the waves closed over them. The light lingered a heartbeat longer, then moved on. Somewhere far beyond where time can count, the universe carried a memory of warmth that did not come from stars. It was a resonance, a pattern etched into everything that could ever feel. When comets brushed each other without collision, when creatures sheltered one another instead of feeding, when civilizations paused before war and listened to their own hearts. It was the echo speaking again. Not command, not doctrine, just a reminder, a whisper between atoms, be gentle. The dark expanded around it, infinite, patient, awake. And for as long as it breathed, it never truly went silent.